This is The Real Story with Michelle Makori.
Tonight on The Real Story, the conflict in Iran. President Trump says military operations in Iran will continue until U.S. objectives are achieved. Exactly what those objectives are is still unclear. Different voices within the administration have emphasized different priorities, leaving some uncertainty about how the White House ultimately defines the endgame for this escalating conflict. Over the past several days, U.S. and Israeli forces have carried out coordinated strikes on Iranian targets across the country. President Trump has declared that the joint U.S.-Israeli operation to crush the threat in Iran is ahead of schedule and that most of the regime's military leaders have been eliminated.
They have no Navy, it's been knocked out. They have no Air Force, it's been knocked out. They have no air detection, that's been knocked out. Their radar has been knocked out. And just about everything's been knocked out. We were having negotiations with these lunatics, and it was my opinion that they were going to attack first. They were going to attack. If we didn't do it, they were going to attack first, and I didn't want that to happen. So if anything, I might have forced Israel's hand. We've had a very, very powerful impact because virtually everything they have has been knocked out now. And the leader of the pack is gone. And as you know, 49 people were taken out in the first hit. And I guess there was another hit today on the new leadership. And it looks like that was pretty substantial also. So they're getting hit very hard, and we'll see what happens. They're just evil. It's not the politics, it's their whole philosophy. It's where they come from. If we didn't do what we're doing right now, you would have had a nuclear war, and they would have taken out many countries, because you know what? They're sick people. They're mentally ill, sick people. They're angry, they're crazy, they're sick.
Meanwhile, Iran has continued retaliatory drone and missile activity across the region, underscoring that while capabilities may be severely degraded, they are not eliminated. Casualties are mounting across the region. U.S. Central Command confirms that 6 American service members have been killed in action, several in an Iranian drone strike in Kuwait. In Israel, at least 12 civilians have been killed from Iranian ballistic missile and drone strikes. Inside Iran, the Iranian Red Crescent reports at least 787 casualties. And beyond the main combatants, the conflict is spreading. In the United Arab Emirates, 3 foreign nationals were killed by falling shrapnel. In Oman, 1 person was killed after the commercial port in Duqm was targeted, and in Bahrain, 2 people were killed. The human toll is rising, and it is no longer confined to a single battlefield. And at sea, tensions around the Strait of Hormuz have intensified. Energy markets have spiked as shipping has slowed dramatically. Insurance rates have surged, and President Trump has announced that the United States will now offer insurance to ships in the Gulf, and that the U.S. military will accompany ships through Hormuz if necessary. So where do things stand? How long will this conflict last? What is the next phase of this war? And what are some of the economic implications? What does this mean for markets, oil, gold, silver, and the dollar? Joining me now to discuss this and more is Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer. Hal is the CEO of Global Risk Intelligence and Planning, or GRIP, a firm specializing in strategic risk intelligence and all-hazard security planning. Hal Kempfer is a retired Marine intelligence officer with more than 2 decades of service. He has advised at the highest levels of military and civil military command and is a frequent contributor across international media. Hal, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Michelle.
All right, Hal, a lot to discuss. And as I said, this is a fast-moving story, but let's start off with some military analysis. President Trump saying that the operation is ahead of schedule, but also saying that it could last another 4 or 5 weeks. What is your assessment of the objectives achieved so far, the situation on the ground, and how long this could last?
I think President Trump actually, he has a different way of explaining things, but I think he kind of explained it pretty well. It is ahead of schedule. One thing is it kicked off with this decapitation strike, taking Ayatollah Khomeini out. He says 49. The numbers have been kind of going up a little bit. I think they're getting a better assessment of how big that strike was. But it was an enormously successful strike, taking out Khomeini and a lot of his very top leadership across the board at the beginning. And doing something like that with a very authoritarian, autocratic society, which means a very authoritarian, autocratic governmental structure, especially in the security services, means you took out key decision makers. And one thing in a system like that is you don't have a lot of initiative at the junior levels. In fact, if anything, that is not something that's encouraged in a very authoritarian system. So when you take them out, you slow down everything. And there's been numerous reports. Yes, they're retaliating. Yes, they're shooting ballistic missiles. Yes, they're sending drones over. But a lot of it looks like these are smaller unit actions. They're kind of on their contingency orders, if you will, or the last thing they were told to do. So they're doing that. And what's interesting is I think they've really created, I think historians will go back and say Iran just made an enormous strategic mistake because they attacked all these Persian Gulf countries, all these Arab countries, the entire Gulf Cooperation Council, every one of those countries has come under attack, especially Saudi Arabia. Jordan has been under attack. Israel, of course, is under immense attack, but they've hit all these different countries. They've hit up into Iraq. And what they have done is they have solidified opposition across the board to Iran. So I would say things are ahead of schedule. From what I can tell from a military standpoint, it's going very well, with a couple of glitches. For example, a friendly fire incident, which fortunately there were no casualties, but the Kuwaitis shot down 3 of our F-15s, which I found rather surprising because we fly there a lot. So I don't know what happened there.
All right. Well, the president and Secretary of State Rubio have signaled that this is only the beginning, that a bigger wave is coming. What do you think that means? What could that look like?
Well, I think the big wave, and this is one of the things it's a lot of times when you're tracking this stuff, it's not what you see, it's what you don't see that you have to track. And what we're not seeing, or definitely not seeing, an increase in the number of ballistic missiles and drones. In fact, we're seeing a stark decrease in the operational tempo of Iranian missiles and drones coming over. That's across the board. That's coming over to Israel. That's coming over to all the Arab countries along the Gulf. That's anything being aimed at U.S. bases. It has really started to drop off. That is an indicator, that's a benchmark, if you will, that we're getting in there and we're taking out their launcher systems. You can have 90 ballistic missiles buried down in a tunnel, but if you take out the launcher system, well, you got 90 missiles that you can't launch. You can't send them anywhere. They're just underground in this tunnel. So part of the strategy is to take out all these launcher systems, and that just slows them down. Now, could they fix them over time? Yeah. But one of the things we're doing is we're denying them time and space. The other thing I want to point out, too, is very quickly we gained air superiority, which means that our aviation, jointly, U.S. and Israel, has superiority in terms of the airspace. Doesn't mean we completely own it. Doesn't mean there's not air defenses you got to be worried about, but we have air superiority. Last June, it appeared towards the end of the 12-day war that Israel had achieved air supremacy. In other words, they were pretty much unobstructed in terms of flying all over Iran and hitting targets at will. I think we're going to get there with air supremacy with this. And when we do, that means we can go around and hit just about anything we want with whatever we have to hit it with. That means that they can't oppose us. Now, he said, President Trump said, took out the Navy. That's one of the few ways they project force. I don't know if we took out all their underwater combatants, and I don't know if their submarines, and I don't know if we took out all their small boats with the Revolutionary Guard Corps, but it sounds like we've taken out their major naval assets, which means they're very limited in what they can do. Took out the Air Force. Wasn't a whole lot of Air Force to take out, honestly. Israel kind of taken out most of the Air Force last June, but what was left, a lot of it was really older aircraft, like old F-4 Phantoms. We're talking planes that flew back in the 60s and 70s that were still being kept together and, very much obsolete, not survivable in the modern aviation battle space, if you will. But those have been taken out, and he talks about taking out radars. All these things are critical to developing a situation where you have air supremacy. And once that happens, it's kind of game over for the regime. At that point, they can't defend anything. And potentially we could, and I mean this jointly, U.S. or Israel or both, we could potentially put limited boots on the ground. maybe a raid, special operation thing, something like that.
I'll get to boots on the ground and what that could entail, but just in terms of timelines here, Hal, because we're hearing estimates of 4 to 5 weeks, but conflicts like this rarely follow such neat timelines. What do you think is a realistic timeline, and what are the actual variables that would determine how long this could drag out for?
I actually thought 4 to 5 weeks was not a bad expectation to put out there. The last one, the 12-day war, that was less than 2 weeks. 4 to 5 weeks, that would be a lot of time to prosecute a lot of targets. So really, basically, if the goal is, take out the Navy, take out the Air Force, take out the ballistic missiles across the board, I think that is achievable. And with that, I think it's kind of implied we take out the drones as well. I think that's very achievable within that time frame. The thing is, and this has been said as well, I think the president even said this, it really depends on what happens in Iran. Is 4 to 5 weeks, assuming that this regime is still the only government that's there governing or trying to govern. If in 2 weeks, everybody comes out in the streets, at 80% plus the population that just can't stand the regime comes out in the streets like they did in December, except this time they're not being met by this very well organized governmental structure where they're going to be slaughtered by the IRGC or something, but instead they're able to move, they're able to take government buildings, they're able to do all those things that would be essentially taking government. Well, if that happens in a couple of weeks, this is not a war that will last 4 to 5 weeks, because essentially at least the combat phase of the war would largely be over. If anything, it would be mopping up, somewhere around the country, taking out old regime remnants. But at that point, there would be nothing. And as someone who remembers very vividly what happened in 1989 to 1991 with the Warsaw Pact countries, with the Soviet Union, sometimes these things can move very quickly, a lot faster than we plan, and they can cause change that literally makes our head spins.
So let's talk about boots on the ground that you mentioned. Obviously, that is a very big concern for many people here in the United States. It's also a concern for the Republicans in terms of perception, in terms of the midterms. But there are a number of factors involved here. Firstly, you would have some, I assume, deeply buried missile or nuclear facilities. Can you be 100% certain that those are gone without physical ground verification? And you mentioned if there is some kind of upswelling, some kind of regime change, do we just let that play out as it would? Would that chaos just ensue unsupervised? If boots on the ground were required, what scenarios would that involve? What would that realistically look like?
There's a lot of options of boots on the ground. Whenever we say boots on the ground, everybody kind of goes back to say, okay, Afghanistan, Iraq, Desert Storm, Vietnam. I can mention Lebanon, Somalia. That's the kind of the impression everybody has when you say that. They're like, oh my gosh, we're going to go in there, put boots on the ground, and we're going to take a horrific amount of casualties. That's the thinking on this. This could be different. In Venezuela, when we got Maduro, technically we have boots on the ground. They weren't there for very long, and they were moving very fast, but they got Maduro and they got out of there, an extremely well conducted operation. That's another version of that, and I think that's what we're seeing. Israel did this very well with Hezbollah and working in some of these things where when the Assad government was still there in Syria. There was at first there was a report that they did this big airstrike up in northern Syria. And then more information came out. Oh, there was an airstrike, but then it was followed up by basically a helicopter raid force that went in, hit the ground, went underground, destroyed everything that they were doing down there, which was basically an ordnance factory that they were creating weapons and bombs and all sorts of stuff, missiles underground. They went in there, cleaned the place out, destroyed it, brought everybody back out, clean extract, and got out of there. That's what I kind of foresee here. There's a lot of facilities all over Iran where they have deeply buried storehouses of ballistic missiles, of drones, of a lot of things tied to weapons, to include things tied to their nuclear program that are just very, very difficult to hit from air. And you saw that what we did during June with the with the B-2 bombers coming in, we actually did something that looked almost like Star Wars. We hit the air shaft, blew that out, and then put bombs down the air shaft. To this day, I'm a Marine. Okay, so when I see the Air Force do something that well, I was like, well, I'm going to have to say something nice about the Air Force. And I'm going to say something nice. It was an amazing job that they did. But we can do that. All right, we can do that. But those are the few and far between. Most often, it's never quite that clean at these facilities. You literally need to go in there the old-fashioned way. Go through the door, go into the tunnels, set the charges, blow everything up, almost like World War II type stuff, and then you get out. And that's kind of what I see as boots on the ground. That doesn't mean it'll be U.S. boots. Could be U.S. boots. We could use our special operations forces. I also think that this is a joint U.S.-Israeli operation. The Israelis do this very well. They have, for lack of a better term, commandos who are extremely good at this. Over the years, I've had more than a few interactions with some of the Israeli special operations soldiers, and they're very, very good at what they do. And I don't see any reason why we couldn't do this jointly. We have some airlift things that they don't have, and I think that would be good. And I could see a combined operation.
Right, but in terms of regime change, if that is in fact the goal here, would there be a similar military presence required as we've seen in other conflict areas where you have U.S. troops facilitating elections or facilitating order after the chaos that comes when a regime falls? Because that would not be a popular political move, I would think.
It'd be very unpopular, and I got to tell you, it's very difficult to pull off, too. As a friend of mine, a colleague, he once said, when you do stuff like that, he says, there's no rule ever written that says you got 18 months. You got 18 months, you better get it all done, because by that time, everyone starts to see you as the enemy, and you need to get out of there. It's difficult to be imposed or supervised or overseen from outside. One of the options that is there, and it's been floating up over and over again, is the idea that the secular military, not the Revolutionary Guard Corps, not they got a couple of ideological, religious type law enforcement militia forces as well, but that the secular military, that they could actually step up and fill that role. Originally in Iraq, the original plan was that the regular military was going to take on that role, and they were going to keep the military and the regular police force in place in order to keep law and order. If that can be done in Iran, and hopefully we learned something from Iraq with that thing we did with de-Baathization or whatever, when we basically stood down the army and everything else, and that just turned into that was the groundwork of what became a huge insurgency that was aimed at us. If we can keep them intact, if we can leverage them to take over, not the Revolutionary Guard Corps, but the regular military and the regular secular police force, then potentially they could actually shepherd in what could become, potentially a functional democracy, but at least something that's not this radical regime that's in there right now.
Well, I have heard the president mention how it was a mistake to fire everyone during the operation in Iraq. And of course, there's talk of the son of the king returning to Iran and seeing how that would potentially result in regime change. But before we get to that, because there's a lot of speculation involved there, I want to focus on the military right now. Who is giving these military orders? If the president says that they've taken out the top leadership, who is actually giving the orders? Who is running the IRGC?
This is really interesting. Yeah, because, the top leadership of the IRGC was taken out at the very beginning. So as near as we can figure, a lot of these IRGC is being operated at the lower levels. I mean, these are sort of like battalion, regiment, brigade level decision makers. And they're operating on what they think is supposed to be done. But so much of the command and control has been degraded across the board, to include the communications has been degraded across the board, that there really isn't that centralized command structure they had before. So what you have is, in many cases, you have rocket, ballistic missile units, drone units out there doing what they were kind of told to do in case something like this happens. And that's certainly what it appears. I think they're trying to reestablish communications. Then again, every time they do that, we're trying to disestablish their communications in that regard. But they're firing out. And I think at some point, that's going to get to hit cumulative mass as well, because you can only do this for so long. And you go, I'm just not getting direction from higher headquarters. What should I keep doing? And trust me, we have folks, and I mean collectively, the Israelis and ourselves, have folks that know how to work that know how to work psychological operations, that know how to kind of get into their thinking process and stuff like that, those lower levels. And so you might see some degradation of that decision making at that level too, but you don't have that centralized command structure. And interesting with the Navy, one of the things that was done was they took out the Navy headquarters. So even before the ships were sunk in the Gulf of Oman, there wasn't a clearly defined headquarters that could command those ships to do anything. And again, with the Navy, with its hierarchical structure, that's in their system, that's very difficult. In our system, it wouldn't be that bad. In our system, it'd be bad, but it wouldn't be as catastrophic because we train everybody to be decision makers. Everybody on the ship is always prepared, and everybody in our system is always prepared to assume at least 2 levels above them. So that's just kind of the way we train. That's the way we think. That's our warfighting experience, is you need to be ready to do that. So we tend to have a lot more autonomous capability to do those things at the lower levels. That's not something you're going to see as an embedded trait with the Iranians.
So if communications have been degraded, does this make retaliation more unpredictable? Does this risk increase the risk of miscalculation? Is this phase then potentially more dangerous because responses may be less coordinated, more impulsive, or are the capabilities sufficiently diminished that is not really a concern?
It is a double-edged sword. First off, you got folks making decisions like this who aren't used to making decisions like this. And so now they're making these decisions. They've been kind of, thrust into this position where they have to. And yes, it'll be uncoordinated, which from a tactical standpoint can be valuable. On the other hand, it makes it very difficult, which is when we're trying to communicate with them, to shut it down, to say, hey, look, we have an agreement. You have the problem of disparate remnants of the organization, which may still be going on the last orders. And there's no way to really clearly tell them, no, stop. We stood down. That's a problem in every war. It's always been a problem in warfare, is getting everybody to stop fighting. And, you can go back to the U.S. Civil War. They may have, signed the agreement at Appomattox Courthouse. But that didn't mean that everybody stopped fighting, because first off, communication was impossible back then. So yeah, it's a big problem.
It's not just communications potentially. I'll put this out there. There are posts online suggesting that this could force Iran, or whatever factions of Iran's leadership may be left, or maybe even these non-leadership factions that could get desperate, into using the secret nuclear capabilities, that this may be a last and desperate act. We do know from Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, he said that during the negotiations, Iran's leaders reportedly told him that they said without any shame, quite proudly, that they control around 460 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. That would quickly be enriched to 90% in order to make nuclear bombs. So this is what they laid out on the table during the negotiations. So the question, Hal, is could there be some kind of secret nuclear capability, or could there be a way to use this uranium in a more dangerous facility, in a more dangerous mechanism, or equally dangerous?
Could there be a nuclear weapon? I'm going to have to give a little credit to Israeli intelligence, U.S. intelligence. Certainly for Israel, that is something that they have focused tremendous resources on trying to figure out. And to my knowledge, we've never seen where they have a nuclear weapon. One thing we have seen is they do have a lot of highly enriched uranium, and that's obviously a big cause of why we're doing this operation, is to stop that from becoming from 60 to 90%, to stop a nuclear weapon. However, they also have a lot of other types of things. Chemical weapons has come up again over and over again. Now that's a huge weapon of mass destruction. I'm sure they have some bio capability. I don't know what specifically they have, but it's the Iranian regime. Of course, they have some sort of biological weapons. And so they do have weapons of mass destruction. One thing, though, is with all that uranium, particularly if it's been refined up to 60%, if that was, if you put just the radioactive material combined with a conventional explosive, it creates what's commonly called a dirty bomb. That is a radiological dispersion device. Now, we have seen where these missiles and drones have been able to, not all of them, but some of them are able to penetrate the air defenses, and they get in and do that. Now, you can imagine if that was packed with radioactive material, that thing explodes. Even if it's taken out in the air and it explodes, you're going to have radiological dispersion. That is a huge psychological weapon. You can imagine if you had, radiological contamination over large parts of Dubai or large parts of Doha or anywhere, that would cause a massive headache for the host nation, because they'd have to be evacuating people, they'd have to be decontaminating people en masse, and then you have to go through and decontaminate those areas. And you can imagine we've looked at this, and I've certainly done exercises where we're looking at how do we decontaminate Los Angeles, for example. Well, how do you decontaminate a major city like Dubai or Abu Dhabi or any of the cities up and around the major metropolitan areas up around the Persian Gulf? It's a huge, huge issue. And so that would obviously be a big, great concern. But I'm pretty sure our targeting methodology is assessing wherever those are right now. And that's also goes back to our boots on the ground thing. That's where you start looking at, if there's a site like that or sites like that, that's where you start looking at, do we want to put special operations boots on the ground to get in there and secure that area, get that material, take it off the board, so to speak, to make sure that nothing like that ever happens. And that's usually a strategic imperative of any military when they're going into a situation like this.
So a dirty bomb is a viable threat. Who would be a target in terms of proximity? How far could this bomb be used?
It can go as far as their drones and missiles will take it. So could they hit Israel? Yeah. Could they hit Jordan? Yes. Could they hit any of the Gulf states? Absolutely. Could they use them against U.S. bases in the Middle East? Yeah, pretty much most of our U.S. bases in the Middle East would all be possible. And the problem with that is, even if you take it out at altitude, it's like a lot of times when you see the Iron Dome and stuff, you'll see the missile coming in, and then, it's taken out, whichever system uses it, whether it's Iron Dome or one of the Arrow missiles or David's Sling. They'll take it out and you see it. But if it goes off in the atmosphere and it's got radioactive material, well, you stop the ballistic missile, but the radioactive material is eventually going to come down. It may disperse because of the winds or everything like that and the altitude, but you're going to have some radioactivity that's going to be detectable. And that's really with RDDs, and we've often said this for years, the danger, I should say the power of the weapon is more psychological a lot of times than it is the actual danger that comes from the radiation itself. Once you know an area you're in is radioactive, that definitely causes panic factor to kick in and makes it very difficult. And if you remember the problem that we had, you remember the problem we had, 9/11. Remember after 9/11, we had those, trying to remember what it was, the biological anthrax. That's right, the anthrax. Yeah, that they had to decontaminate all these places. One of the things that was kind of funny about that was that they went in there and they kept decontaminating these offices in the congressional office building, and they finally got to a point and they go, well, we haven't completely gotten rid of it, but we have now got to a manageable level of anthrax contamination. Now I always thought about the workers in that office going, oh, great, I'm going back to the office where we have a manageable level of anthrax contamination. That's the same problem you have with radiation, is you're not going to get all of it. At some point you say, okay, it's good enough to go back in, but everybody's sitting there going, yeah. All right. So, and for a city like Dubai, can you imagine with tourism and everything, would you want to take a vacation to Dubai knowing that there's a manageable level of radioactive contamination in the city? It can have long-term implications, as you can well imagine.
Well, how obviously Iran is notorious for being one of the largest, if not the largest, state sponsor of terrorism. What about terrorist proxies and potential attacks on the United States? We've had years of open borders effectively under the Biden administration. How much of a concern is that?
Well, one thing we've always had in the U.S., and we've assessed this for decades, is we've had Iranian operatives, for lack of a better term. We have a very large Persian expatriate community in certain concentration areas around the United States. For example, Los Angeles has a very large expatriate Persian community. Michigan does. New York, New York has a large everything community from everywhere in the world, but they have a large Persian, and then we have large Lebanese expatriate communities. Within that, that makes it easy for operatives from whether Hezbollah or from Al-Quds or whatever to operate clandestinely within the community, obviously trying to pretend that they're not what they are. But we have picked up over the years lots of stuff showing where they've been surveilling critical infrastructure, places where they can potentially be targets for, going for, mass murder type of things, like sporting events and, stadiums and things like that. So that's a big concern. And then we've always talked about, would there ever be a scenario where they would get operationalized? Because usually they're just doing criminal stuff, money laundering, counterfeit goods, stuff like that to raise money to send back home. But they are trained. And the question is, would something trigger them to become operational? And frankly, I think we're at that something that would trigger them to be operational. So everybody is leaning forward. Everybody's looking for the indicators. Everybody's looking for suspicious activity. And of course, if there's anybody that we have suspected that might be in that category, you can bet they're getting a famous knock and talk where somebody's going to go to their door, probably from the FBI, and say, "Hey, we know who you are. We know what you're doing," to try and deter them from whatever they're planning to do.
All right, let's bring it back to the Middle East. You're saying that so far objectives have been achieved and things are going according to plan from what we can determine. What happens that changes the trajectory of this conflict negatively from the United States and Israel's perspective? What could not go according to plan here? We touched on the dirty bomb idea, but what could be something that derails what seems to be positive progress in terms of achieving their objectives?
I think the great fear, and I know certainly the planners, the intelligence, senior intelligence officers, everybody working on this, must have been working on, because this is always the great concern. When you attack a country, you can also trigger a massive outpouring of patriotism. That's just normal. Even if you hated the government, a lot of times being attacked from an outside force, in this case, if they're Iranians and they're under attack by the U.S. and Israel, that could cause some to say, "Well, I hate the regime, but I don't want these outside countries, taking over my country," or whatever it is, and you cause an opposite reaction. So instead of supporting those who are trying to overthrow the regime, we could inadvertently undermine those by pulling the rug out from under them, because popular opinion could shift.
But have we seen that, Hal? I mean, considering that this was an exceptionally oppressive regime that massacred its own citizens, had absolutely no civil rights for women, just to name a few points. And there seems, and as before we had this attack, there has been an uprising on the streets of a lot of people trying to oust this regime. Is that a real concern with the majority of people in Iran?
That would be the concern. I'm not saying it's something that we've seen. One thing I did notice, there is at least the Iranians are reporting a girls' school was hit.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and they're reporting mass casualties. I think over like 160 people were killed and stuff, and they're saying most of them were children. I don't know if I'm a little skeptical that the U.S. and Israeli air forces.
I thought it was reported that was in fact an Iranian missile.
That's what I thought from the beginning, and that's what I keep hearing. I want that finally confirmed, that was an Iranian missile. I'm pretty sure that was. We're very careful about what we do, but you see, and certainly Iranians have been trying to spin that. Oh, those callous, uncaring Israeli and American, airmen out there, hitting our schools and stuff. Of course, they're going to spin it that way to put us in the worst possible light. But that would be the sort of triggering thing that they would do in order to create that situation where people might turn and say, well, the regime is horrible, but look what these foreign military forces did to our school. But I actually looked at that. I go, in fact, when that first popped up, I go, dollars to donuts. I'm absolutely sure that the Iranians hit that school by mistake, because that's the sort of thing the Iranians would do. And so it's appearing that's probably what happened. But that's the sort of thing, that's the sort of stuff that the Iranian regime would twist.
That's a sentiment issue, though, Hal. Is there any sort of military action? I mean, so far we've seen Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the other Muslim countries in the region side with the U.S. effectively. So I'm assuming that's not a concern. From a military perspective, we haven't we don't expect China to get involved here, or do we? We have heard some strong diplomatic condemnations against the United States and Israel, saying that this military action in Iran is brazen aggression and a flagrant violation of international law. But we don't see. Well, let me ask you this: do you see any other parties joining this conflict against the United States and Israel?
I think Russia would like to do something, but they're not able to do something. And actually, in some ways, in fact, one of the reports was that they had actually that Putin had told Khamenei, he says, "Look, we're tied up with Ukraine. We don't have any extra resources to help you out with." And I actually think maybe it might be that simple. China has been very much involved in Iran. In fact, they had almost, one could say in a way, they had almost completed, they had an agreement that looked like part of the Belt and Road Initiative using Iran. And of course, that caused us a great deal of concern that they were bringing them in. They're a close ally. They buy a lot of oil from Iran. But there are limits to what China can do, and they can't really project force in that way. The only things I could see militarily that really could cause some issues, I don't know that we've taken out a lot of the submarine presence or submarine capability that Iran has. They have quite a few submarines. They're old. They're not great. But if they're sitting quietly on the bottom of the Strait of Hormuz, they're formidable because they're completely quiet. You can't see them. And they could potentially cause a lot of problems interrupting or intercepting, maritime movement through there. Also, sea mines. That's another one. Doesn't get a lot of attention. They have a big sea mine capability. They also have this small boat capability with the Revolutionary Guard Corps that could cause a lot of problems, cause a lot more problems. They put out a lot of sea mines. And that's taking advantage of the fact that we don't have sufficient mine countermeasures capability to clear that as well as we'd like to clear it. And that's just that's a shortfall in the U.S. Navy. It's a shortfall in a lot of navies. We look at sea mines, we go, "Oh, that's World War II. That's old." And it's like, no, it's not. It's a big, big problem. And after the Cold War, we basically got rid of a lot of our mine countermeasure ships, and now we're at a deficit. So that's something I could see that could cause a really big problem for us militarily.
Right. Sea mines and submarines potentially causing major disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz. Let's focus on that now. It is, of course, a key oil choke point right now that has been roiling global energy markets. About 20 million barrels of crude go through the Strait of Hormuz every day, representing roughly 1/5 to 1/4 of oil shipments. A similar share of liquefied natural gas flows through there. We do know that some vessels have been attacked or hit by Iranian drones and missiles in or near the strait. War risk insurers have effectively pulled coverage, which has been a big problem, a huge deterrent, because it's forced global shippers to suspend transits and their rerouting away from the region. The president has come out and said that the U.S. will now provide insurance guarantees and naval escorts to ensure safe passage for oil tankers and other vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. He says the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation will offer insurance to help ensure that the flow of energy and other commercial trade in the Gulf will continue, and that the U.S. Navy will be escorting tankers through the Strait of Hormuz if necessary, as he posted on Truth Social. No matter what, the United States will ensure the free flow of energy to the world. What's your read on what we can realistically expect to see with oil flowing through there and the oil markets?
Well, I think we're going to see some ships under escort. This really harkens back to another era. Back in the 80s, again with the Iranians, we actually had a flagging program where we flagged tankers, and then we gave them military escorts going through the Strait of Hormuz and into the Persian Gulf, and that was to deter the Iranians from attacking those tankers. And it worked pretty well. Sea mines became an issue back then too, but it worked pretty well as far as what we're doing with that. So we're doing this thing where we're going to provide risk insurance. Now, I'm not sure it's really, we're at the cusp of this because President Trump just announced it. I haven't seen all the details yet. One of my questions would be, okay, are we going to do temporary reflagging of tankers going through there? Because that would be something I'm sure from a legal standpoint would simplify a lot of things if those were U.S. flagged vessels. That makes it easier for us to do a lot of things, particularly if we're providing insurance for those vessels. That would simplify things, and that's not that difficult to pull off. It can be done, and then using our ships as escorts going through there. That's still going to be an issue with sea mines, still an issue with submarines, and I'm sure that we are doing a lot of ASW, anti-submarine warfare stuff with our capabilities there to try and identify wherever those submarines are that the Iranians may have somewhere along the bottom of the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz area. Also, we're probably bringing in every mine countermeasure capability we can. That's actually one where it would really help if we get some of the Europeans on board, because some of those European navies actually have more mine countermeasure capability than we do. But it is one way that they can start moving. The other thing that they can do, though, is there is excess capacity in some of these pipelines. For example, in the UAE, they have a pipeline that actually runs on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz, dumps into a terminal on the Gulf of Oman. That's an option. It has excess capacity that they can take up. The famous East-West pipeline across Saudi Arabia that goes over to the Red Sea, it has excess capacity that they could use as well, so they could actually put some of that oil in there. It's not enough to displace that 20 million barrels a day. I think we're looking somewhere around 2.5 to 2.7 million barrels per day. Did I say billion? I think 20 million a day, and 2.5 to 2.7 million barrels a day could be actually surged out through that. That might help keep some sort of pressure, keeping the price of oil down by doing that. And then that with this escort concept and the U.S. providing risk mitigation and insurance for the ships might be enough to put some pressure to keep oil prices from peaking. Right now, I think Brent crude is sitting, it's around $75, $77 per barrel. If you go back a couple weeks ago, I think it was sitting about $67 per barrel, something like that. It would fluctuate up and down a couple dollars here and there. The fear is that it could actually go up over $100 a barrel. But I think if we do all these other measures, and it looks like that the war is progressing in a way that the threat to the region, but particularly to the Strait of Hormuz, starts to dissipate, that you might see a lower cap on where that oil price surge will go. And that'll help a lot. That'll help a great deal.
And I'm assuming we have enough vessels to escort these ships.
I'm hoping. Look, I'll be the first one to tell you.
But to your point, I mean, we could, the United States could get other assistance from other allies and countries, and it has been quite interesting, as we touched on before, that the UAE and Saudi Arabia have been backing the United States. So even if the European allies don't want to cooperate, could you see some kind of coalition working together to escort these ships? It's in their interests.
I think so. I certainly the GCC countries would. They don't have large navies, but they do have some significant combatants. I've worked with a number of these navies over the years, and very well trained crews. They're very professional, and I could see us putting together these combined task force or some sort of combined task force setup where we would escort these ships in and out of the through the Strait of Hormuz
Mhm.
across the board. And that's very normal for us to do that. If you remember the piracy issue off of Somalia, that was a combined task force thing. All the stuff that we've been doing with the Houthis and their anti-ship stuff, that's a combined task force thing. So to set up a combined task force in that particular region, working with U.S. Central Command in that region, or under U.S. Central Command in that region, working with our allies out there, very reasonable. And I think some countries might be willing to jump in and help. For example, you may have seen that President Trump just met with Chancellor Merz and
In
uh,
Germany.
the
Yeah.
CEO of Germany, and Germany has great navy, and they have a lot of unique capabilities, to include mine countermeasures, from my recollection, and so they might be willing to jump in. I'm not seeing France jumping in right away. Macron's made that pretty clear, but then I always remember what General Schwarzkopf said, that going to war without France is kind of like going hunting without an accordion. Well, so, anyway, but there are a number of navies I could see that would be willing to get involved, and that could create something where we have enough ship capability, escort capability.
So it doesn't sound like you are too concerned that this holds up oil shipments for an extended period of time. It seems
I-
like you're thinking it's reasonable to resolve this relatively quickly.
I think it may. I don't think it's going to take maybe the whole 4 or 5 weeks. I could be wrong. I mean, obviously, yeah. Have we collectively ever made a mistake on predicting Middle Eastern wars? Oh, I think we've got a pretty good track record in that. And so I think it's very possible. But I think this is one that is achievable, that we can figure out how to get oil out of there. And the other thing too is, I think there'll probably be a surge in production from other areas that will, you got other areas that can surge production up to produce more oil, and then using alternate means in order to get oil out, as not reliant on a tanker
Right.
going through the Strait of Hormuz. If you put all these things together, you can basically decrease the pressure on the price of oil.
So we may get oil flowing, but this still impacts China quite dramatically, because China has been getting cheap oil from Iran and from Venezuela. China imports, I believe, around 11 million barrels of oil per day, and the Iranian barrels have been a very big part of that mix. They do still get some from Russia, and they were getting a lot from Venezuela. So cheap sanctioned oil has helped Beijing manage costs. What does this mean for China in terms of access to energy? And is that part of the bigger Trump administration agenda here?
I would probably, I don't want to put this too far, but China is always on our mind. Okay. And certainly, China getting a lot of oil. I think, between China and Iran, I think they were getting close to almost 3 million barrels a day. So it was a lot of oil. That's a big chunk of that 11.1 million or whatever they import every day. So it's a big chunk. But they also buy oil from other countries that's shipped through the Persian Gulf. So as long as the Straits of Hormuz are closed, well, they're not getting oil from their other sources either. So they're in a significant conundrum. They're stuck right now, and so when this thing is resolved, effectively, U.S. has control over the export of Venezuelan oil. We may not control the country, maybe as much as we advertise, but we definitely control what oil they can ship out, and we'll be in the same position with Iran. We'll be able to control what oil they ship out, and that's something that I think China would feel very nervous about. I think it's going to make them. The thought is that it will dampen some of their hegemonic ambitions in terms of doing something against Taiwan. That they will look at their situation and say, maybe we may not want to, upset this world order too much more because of our dependence on oil from places that are controlled by the U.S. The other thing that's happening, and it's not in terms of gross numbers, it may not seem like a big deal, but you're seeing not just the U.S., but a number of countries around the world. I think Belgium a few days ago just stopped a dark fleet tanker. We've seen Baltic countries stopping dark fleet tankers. Britain stopped dark fleet tankers. We and Britain together stopped a dark fleet tanker that was flagged to Russia. And we saw India, which was importing Russian oil until very recently, and they were stopping, I think, 3 dark fleet tankers in the Indian Ocean. So a lot of this tanker sanctions busting dark fleet tanker fleet that runs around the world, it's getting intercepted on a pretty regular basis. And even if they're not stopped for bringing in Russian oil, they can be tied to bringing in other sanctioned oil from elsewhere in the world. And if it stops those ships, pretty soon it makes the risk quotient for doing that type of activity much higher. And if you have higher risk, you're going to have less that want to get involved. So China's looking at the Russian oil and probably scratching their heads and saying, is that going to be as reliable as it was either? And they're probably looking at Russia across the board and scratching their heads on a lot of things. I personally think the Russian economy is in real trouble right now. And their oil industry, now that the Ukrainians can hit their pipelines and hit their ports and stuff with relative ease, there's a lot of things that would make China very nervous about the access to Russian oil.
So that brings up 2 questions, and I'll focus on this one first. How much of this operation in Iran is really about limiting China's access to cheap oil, asserting control over global oil settlement, and most importantly, maintaining the petrodollar and reinforcing dollar demand at a time when it has been waning and at a time of massive U.S. deficits? Is this really, or at least partly, about the petrodollar?
I would not be surprised if I was in the White House and I was in a planning meeting. I would not be surprised if that was brought up. Okay. In fact, I would be shocked if that wasn't fully discussed. That wouldn't be the state reason. Everything you just said, if I went out there and gave a speech as a president or something like that and said, this is why we're going in there, I think I get the biggest room full of blank stares ever. And then people shaking their heads going, what are we doing? And so obviously the justification for what we're doing is, obviously to stop the radical regime of Iran from ever getting a nuclear weapon where they could threaten Israel or any country in the Middle East, or potentially threaten countries as far away. Because you look at the ballistic missile capabilities that they've been developing, that they can, and certainly the drone capabilities as well. They can threaten countries far away. In fact, it's not fully deployed or fielded, but they do have a missile that has a range that goes up into Eastern Europe, to give you an idea. And they would want to get a missile that can go all the way over to hit North America. So that's one that I think people could definitely understand a lot easier. It's very apparent as to why that would want to be stopped. And then, of course, you just look at just the nature of the regime, spreading terrorism around the region, spreading war around the region. What's been happening in Gaza was that's the Hamas, and Hamas is a proxy of Iran. So everything you're looking at in there, Iran's behind that. They're behind all the stuff in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah. All the problems they've been having with the Houthis, that's Iran is behind all of that. So there are a lot of very good reasons I think more people can gravitate to as to why Iran has to be dealt with. But I think, yes, petrodollars and access to oil and everything tied to that is certainly just below the surface. That's something that we have to think about. And I also think that what comes out of this thing with Iran could, and because of what this is going to do to China's status around the world, particularly on the economic side, I think this might also staunch China's push to try and supplant the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. I think it may reinforce the dollar's position in that. And honestly, there are some economists that say, well, that's a little bit problematic for the U.S. because it tends to keep the dollar very high, which really causes some issues in exports. But I like having a dollar. I mean, personally, I like having the dollar as a reserve currency of the world.
So now we've hit on a topic that we cover quite extensively on this channel, Hal. And just as reference, the petrodollar came about after a deal was struck with the Saudis in 1974 to only sell oil in US dollars and then reinvest that money into US treasuries. And that effectively made the US dollar essential to purchase oil around the world, a trend that has been breaking over the last couple of years, especially with the excessive weaponization of the dollar under the Biden administration. We've seen countries buy oil using other currencies, and that has taken a hit on the dollar's dominance. Now, back in 1974, the deal was for military protection in exchange for buying oil only in dollars. And we have seen the US dollar rise as we're seeing the US military flex its might around the world now. Are you saying that this conflict, if it goes according to plan, if it does play out as the Trump administration would like it to play out, effectively asserts confidence in the US dollar?
I think it will. I do think it'll reassert confidence. If you go back like a dozen plus years, there was and certainly 15 years ago, there was a lot of talk. It's like, oh, the euro is going to become the alternate reserve currency of the world. That never really quite happened, but there was a lot of thought of that. The yuan is definitely, they'd like to see if that could become the reserve currency. I just don't think that's possible, and I think there's a lot of reasons why it's not possible. But there's and certainly there's been a lot of thought of this reserve currency. And if you go back, way before, the British pound was the reserve currency of international commerce way back. And but I do think this, with Iran is not just a regional issue. It's not just a Middle Eastern issue. As you've alluded to, and as we've talked about, it really extends far afield. I mean, it impacts China, it impacts Russia, it impacts it impacts all of its proxy stuff, to include proxy stuff that's operating in the Western Hemisphere. So it has a huge distended impact if there is a significant regime change there, and it changes the balance of power around the world. I mean, I'm looking at what's happening in Iran, and if that does change over and it becomes a pro-Western regime, my eyes immediately avert. And interestingly, President Trump's eyes averted there too, apparently, over to Cuba, which is, can Cuba now withstand this shift that's taken place? They've lost their primary access to oil from Nicaragua. Nicaragua, from Venezuela. I was going to talk about Nicaragua next. And of course, they're looking at the whole hemisphere. They're looking at their economy, which is pretty much not working at all. I mean, they're getting aid from Canada at this point in order to keep going. So I do think that whatever happens in Iran is going to have some second, third order effects around the world in ways that that do seem rather asymmetric. And I think that Cuba could fall. And then, of course, as I was alluding to, I also think Nicaragua is going to switch over as well. But there's a lot of reasons why Nicaragua is going to change. But I don't see them standing as what they have been for some time with the Ortega regime and all that stuff.
So a few issues there. I mean, firstly, I think it's hard to argue with the case that taking out this despotic regime in Iran is not a good thing for human rights, for global security, for international safety. I know people have different viewpoints on this matter and the Trump administration at large, but certainly I think the Iranian regime being gone or almost gone is definitely a positive, again, keeping in mind that Iran was the largest state sponsor of terrorism around the world. But I want to touch on what that could mean for the Middle East and touch on what this could mean, again, back for China. But you're saying that this could cause Cuba to fall. And does that then continue to solidify that Monroe doctrine, a la the Monroe doctrine of creating a stronger Western Hemisphere, a stronger perimeter around the Western Hemisphere?
I absolutely see that. Obviously in the Middle East, if I could just take that, Hezbollah is obviously they've been between mostly Israeli action, but also the Lebanese government kind of finding its voice finally. They've been saying, look, they're going to disarm. That's what the Lebanese government position is. They got to disarm. They have to demilitarize. That's what the agreement is. They disarm, they demilitarize. And of course, Hezbollah says, no, we're not going to disarm. We're not going to demilitarize. And they would love to get back to where they were. Hezbollah, which was an interesting strategic decision on their part, has now entered in on the side of Iran by launching missiles into Israel, and of course, actually launching missiles into Beirut, which is kind of odd. So they now they're a player, and of course, Israel's going to deal with Hezbollah. But I think that if Iran, next couple of weeks, if Iran or a few weeks, Iran's regime changes over, I think that's something where Hezbollah says, we're done. Obviously, Hamas has been holding off disarming as well. That's been a real, it's a very difficult thing. But I don't see Hamas being able to sit there and say, we can't disarm if there's no Iran. If Iran is no longer there to support them, even as a symbolic force, if they're no longer there, they can stop. They could stop from the disarming, but they can't do so in committing suicide. And then the Houthis are also in the same position. And then, of course, Iraq has been trying to get the Shiite militias under the Popular Mobilization Front umbrella to disarm. And I think that will also pick up steam as well, because their primary sponsor, the one thing that they could point to and say, that's where we get support, will no longer be there.
Well, I guess the point that you're making, Hal, is that this could indeed be a pivotal, game-changing move for the entire Middle East if Iran, and this is an if Iran is effectively the regime there replaced with a pro-Western government and leadership and ceases to sponsor all of these terrorist proxies around the world. If you have the United Arab Emirates already having peace deals with Israel, with the Abraham Accords, Saudi Arabia looking very keen to normalize ties with Israel. The Sunni states have initially, under the premise of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, the collective fear of Iran brought them together. I wonder if that still holds without an Iran, but let's assume that it does. You have a dynamic in the Middle East that changes quite dramatically. What would that look like? Do you have a very different Middle East dynamic? Dare we even say some kind of peace in the Middle East?
Oh, you got to be careful about that peace word, because everybody throws that out. But I would say this: I do think that it would be a completely new era. One thing is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, which is that has a lot of meaning, more meaning in the Middle East than some other places.
Right,
but,
which is why the Saudis and Israel were united to a degree, at least on a clandestine level, against Iran.
I wouldn't know anything about what you're talking about, but let's say it is so. Okay. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, they've all worked together because of the Iranian threat. The interesting thing that Iran did, this regime did, was they attacked places that have not been attacked. Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha. These are major international hub cities. This is where, I mean, if you're trying to go someplace from a place that's had a lot of problems, like war, you get a place in Dubai or Abu Dhabi or someplace like that. And now these have become battlefields. There's a huge psychological element here in this. And I think what this has done is it's brought together, I tell you, it's like a shot of adrenaline into the Gulf Cooperation Council that they turned fast. I mean, they turned on a dime and all pointed in unison at Iran's regime and said, there's the enemy. And I don't rule out in the coming weeks, depending on how this goes, if you don't see one or more of those countries actually get involved with kinetic operations in support of this overall military operation, because it is a fundamental shift that's taken place. And the reason I mention that is what has held together this kind of coalition of the Abraham Accords to a large extent was the threat of Iran. I do think that the fact that they all faced together their common enemy and hopefully soon will prevail collectively, I think that may have some very positive ripples, if you will, across the discourse of the Middle East. I think it actually might be a wave that kind of pushes Saudi Arabia and Israel into normalizing relations faster than they may have been doing before. And I think part of that will be that the state sponsor of Hamas, even though it's a Sunni organization, they were sponsored by Al-Quds under the Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran. Without that, I do think that kind of mitigates or neutralizes some of the political tension that obviously the royal family certainly feels in normalizing relations with Israel because of the Hamas issue. I don't think that that becomes less of an issue, and I actually think that there's and certainly I'm going to say the Crown Prince I think can negotiate something with Bibi Netanyahu where it'll basically deal with both the issues that both countries have to deal with to make something make normalization happen.
I mean, it could go the other way. Having lost that common threat of Iran, it could potentially go in the other direction if what united them was this common enemy.
It could, but I also remind everybody, look, this in the Middle East, this kind of reminds me of the aftermath of World War II in Europe. And even though the communist threat was what united Western Europe very quickly, there was a certain common cause that came out of what happened in World War II. The U.S. was working very closely with a number of countries over there in ways we never worked with these countries. And that really did carry over to some of the things that came out, like the United Nations was something that came out of that. And
and we all know what a spectacular success that has been, Hal.
I'm just saying, okay, it was just, but nonetheless, it was part of that, what happened, there was common cause and it was done. And if you look at what happened with the League of Nations, I'd say it was marginally better.
I will also point out that allegedly Qatar is also a big sponsor of what the United States and Israel consider terrorist organizations as well. So, and has notoriously played both sides of this conflict. So, and you do have certain ideological issues here that may prevail in terms of some jihadist ideological mentalities that are not necessarily every country or every person in the region, but that may still prove to be problematic here. I do want to bring it back to a topic that our audience is very interested in, and that is, of course, gold and silver as we start to wrap up here. Silver is, of course, essential for modern warfare. Silver is essential for modern warfare. It always has been. Especially in today's world of hypersonic missiles, drones, satellite guidance systems, advanced electronics, the demand is on another level. Take the Tomahawk missile, for example. I believe that estimates say that contains around 500 ounces of silver, roughly 16 kilograms in just one weapon. And once that missile is fired, that silver is vaporized, permanently gone. Now, it's interesting, Hal, that the Silver Institute breaks global demand into various categories, but it never gives you a clear category for military consumption. It gives you categories like jewelry and silverware and photovoltaics, but it skips out military consumption. So, Hal, we're seeing thousands of missiles, advanced weapon systems being deployed, drones being used, missiles being fired. These stockpiles now need to be rebuilt. Firstly, in your opinion, how much silver is actually being absorbed by defense production? Because again, this is not a statistic that is officially reported on. In fact, some would say it's very suspicious that it is actually omitted from any reports. But how significant is the amount of silver that is being used in this modern day weaponry?
I don't know. And it could be in the thousands of metric tons. I don't know how much is. It's a lot. But one of the things I did look at, and this kind of goes to the Western Hemispheric, the Monroe doctrine, if you will, is there's been a shift. And I mentioned, I think Iran is a part of this overall shift. Part of the things we're seeing is Mexico. They went after Jalisco New Generation. They went after El Mencho. They got him. And you go, what does that have to do with silver? Well, if you're in the silver world, Mexico is the biggest producer of silver overall. All right.
That's right.
And I can tell you, having done some stuff with with, as you know, metals and stuff, not silver, but another metal down there, that China gets in there and they get their foot in the door and they cut contracts. And all of a sudden we have this vast reserve of rare earths and other metals that we need, just south of the border. And we're getting cut out because that stuff's going across the Pacific or to China. That's a shift. I think that's a big shift that's taking place down there. Certainly, President Trump has put a lot of pressure on the Sheinbaum administration down there to do a lot more with the U.S. Going after the cartels as part of it. But I really see the metals market across the board as another big part because Mexico is such a dominant player, bigger, getting to be a bigger player in things like lithium, but definitely a big player, the biggest player by far. If you look
That's
at
right.
it in terms of silver, I mean, a lot bigger. I mean, Mexico alone is bigger than Russia, China combined. You start looking, and then you look further south. You got Peru. Now again, China is in there. They have the super port they put in there. But you may have seen more recently that the U.S. is kind of reasserting itself. We're putting a bigger military presence down there so we can keep an eye on that super port. You saw in Panama where, Hutchinson's, which is a Hong Kong-based company, was basically forced out by their Supreme Court from holding two large port areas on each end of the canal. It's part of what I'm seeing is a shift in the Western Hemisphere towards the U.S. and away from all these, Chinese corporate and Chinese government incursions into the Western Hemisphere. That goes directly to silver. That goes directly to metals across the board. And so I see that as a big thing. And of course, Bolivia is also a major player in this as well. And so I see that. And of course, Australia is another significant silver producer. And we have a very good relationship with Australia, a little rocky at times with some of the more recent things, but pretty good overall. So, and Chile is also a big producer of silver. I think we have a great relationship with Chile. And then Poland. Now, a lot of the silver that's produced in Europe, you got to remember that Europe's also going through a massive investment in military hardware as well. So I don't really see that. I actually see a lot of that silver just staying in the European market, period. But I do see the U.S. Making some strategic moves that may not be apparent, but they're pretty apparent to me, to basically lock in our supply of silver because we know we're going to need it for things like weapon systems. But it's not just weapon systems; it's all high tech stuff. It's a ubiquitous metal that's needed.
Right, and silver has recently been added to the critical minerals list by the Trump administration, meaning that it is deemed essential for the economy and for national security. But curiously, Hal, as we're seeing silver being depleted to some degree with this weaponry, and as I mentioned, once these missiles are fired, that silver is gone. We had silver trading down on the day. Spot silver was down more than 8% on the day at around $82 an ounce at the time of this recording. What do you make of that?
I thought that was kind of odd. It's almost counterintuitive. I don't know. I think some of it is the market may be building into the pricing model that there'll be more availability of silver. And I think that's not an unreasonable thing to think about. There's a lot of things, I do a lot with maritime security, maritime domain issues. And of course, not a dominant issue, but always in there as we talk about underwater mining. There are a lot of sources for minerals to include silver that we just haven't been accessing for a lot of reasons. The whole issue with Greenland and whatever's in Greenland, and it is a little bit, it really is almost like metals wildcatting, if you will.
Right.
Well, no, it's buried under a lot of ice. We're not quite sure what's down there. We have some projections of what we think is down there, but there's a lot of places that with technology, particularly with AI and robotics, that we're going to be able to get in there and do things that we never could do before. I was just at the CES conference in Las Vegas last month, and I looked at the array of robotics capabilities, and a lot of them are more for show stuff, like dancing robots and stuff like that. But there is an industrial layer there of what robots can do and what we can do with autonomous systems, which has a huge impact on mining, an enormous impact on mining.
Right. Well, I mean, supply and some newfound optimism about supply could be a factor here. I know that many analysts that we've had on the show would perhaps make the argument that this could be some kind of manipulation of the silver market, especially via futures contracts, as we've seen happen a lot of times, the paper silver market manipulated and suppressed. And many would say that it could be, and again, this is a conspiracy, but many would say that this is intentional suppression via the military industrial complex, especially at this kind of time. I don't know if you're picking up the sirens in the background, but it's quite interesting that as I'm saying this, we're having sirens blaring in the background. Hal, let's focus on gold as we start to wrap things up here. We had spot gold also down on the day, closing below 5,100 an ounce. Remember, gold is priced in dollars, so the stronger the dollar, that is reflected in the price of gold. But gold is typically a safe haven that people go to in times of geopolitical strife. What does it signal to you that gold was actually down today?
I found that rather interesting, and that to me, and I don't know if I should read this into it because there's a lot of factors that goes into gold, and I think I've shared with you, gold is kind of near and dear. My dad was a gold miner, and I grew up, climbing around gold mines. Which later, when I got big, I go, why did my dad let me down those gold mines? But that's another issue. Anyway, but gold is near and dear. But back then, it was, and I'm showing my age here. It was pegged. It wasn't. You couldn't mine it because it wasn't worth that much. Now it's very interesting because I think the geopolitical side of what's ever happening in the world, because it is a safe haven investment, that it really does reflect whatever people feel about the global economy and what's happening out there. I think there's a couple of things. Number one, I think that they're looking at the initial success in Iran, and I think that's factored in. And it's like, well, this may actually go well. So I think that's part of the thinking there. I also think that they're looking at what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, and I think there's a thinking that that situation will resolve in a more equitable manner, something where it won't be quite as cataclysmic as what some thought it might be. So I think there may be some of that, and I do think some of it is the ripples that come off of these very successful things, like taking Maduro down in Venezuela. It's what it's done is you're taking some of these radical nation state actors off the board, if you will. They're just not there to disrupt the global economy in ways that they could. And I think all those things together kind of build into the psychology of the market. And so you see a little dip in gold, and I think that may have a lot to do with it.
Well, we have seen equities sell off on this uncertainty across many sectors, at least for now. But it is an interesting point that you kind of touched on before, and that is renewed confidence in the dollar as the U.S. flexes its military muscle, and a reminder that the U.S. became the global reserve currency after it helped the Allies win World War II in Bretton Woods. And that strength on the global stage as what has kept the U.S., whether you agree or not, is a whole other conversation, but what has kept the U.S. as the global superpower, and a reminder of that military might is sending people back to the safe haven of the dollar, which would only, I would imagine, continue should this war in Iran continue to go more or less as planned.
If it continues to be a continuing positive stories, and little things today I thought was very good, with the report that the Council of Advisors that picks the next supreme leader may have been taken out in an airstrike. Okay, I'm a military guy, so I see that as a positive thing. But anyway, I think that says that puts a big shot in the arm that whatever regime comes out of this thing won't just be a continuation of what we saw before, because that really is a setback. If it turns out to be completely true, which it looks like it's pretty accurate what happened there, it is a setback for the current regime, which makes it more difficult for them to maintain continuity going forward as they're getting more setbacks on the battlefield, so to speak. And I use the word battlefield because most people think of battlefields as media engagements between armies on the ground or whatever. In this case, the battlefield is air, space, everything else that's going on in Iran. So I just see that as a very positive thing. If you're looking for a more optimistic outlook on what could come out of this military operation in Iran, I think that would be very positive. And I think all that reflects in things like gold, and it also reflects in the dollar.
I would like to point out, though, that regime change has never actually gone according to plan, at least explicitly according to plan, and at any time there's been an interference. But let's see. I mean, I can't argue with the fact that replacing this regime is definitely a positive, and one could say that any other power that steps in here could only be better. At least equally as bad, but more likely better.
I would say this, though. We all were very skeptical back in the early 90s. Will these new countries like the Baltic states and stuff, is this going to really stay there, or is this going to devolve into an autocratic sort of thing? Some of the former Soviet states did evolve into autocratic dictatorships, all right? However, having spent some time, in places like Estonia, Lithuania, and, you look at it and you go, wow. It's just that actually exceeded all expectations of what happened there. And there are places in the world, and, I just got back from Africa. Every place you go, there's always a troubled history somewhere if you go back enough decades. And you look at it and you go, maybe not perfect, but a lot better. And so I am a little hopeful that in the end, some of these things we do to shape democracy and shape, new regimes, they may not be perfect, but they're better than what was there before. And so I'm somewhat hopeful. I have a lot of faith in the Iranian or the Persian people. I just find it's a very sophisticated, smart society across the board. And I think that, if they could toss off this yoke of this autocratic, theocratic, dictatorship, whatever you want to call it, that I think there's some real good that could come to the surface in terms of the governance model that goes forward.
Persia was indeed a leading part of history and a thriving civilization, and certainly Iran was a very different Iran up until the 1970s. We'll end it on that optimistic note. Hal, thank you. As always, appreciate your analysis and your time. Hal Kempfer, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Michelle.
And as always, thank you so much for our viewers for watching. Again, if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. And leave us your comments, positive or negative. We do love to hear from you. As I like to say, feel free to praise, whine, or just opine. For me, Michelle Makori, and the rest of the team, we will see you next time. Until then, stay sovereign.
This is The Real Story with Michelle Makori.